Thoughtful, articulate, artist gifted, grammatical. Circular sources brimming with rich, flammable food for your thoughts, plated a different animal. Rounds on me, keep tabs, we insurmountable. Swerve, hey, Merle.
Happy Tuesday. Hello and welcome to another What's on Your Mind. It's been a good week so far because it's only been 2 days, but it's been a decent 2 days, so that's always a plus. Today I'm excited. I have Dr. Samuel with me, and we're going to be talking all about relationships, which should be a good question because I feel like we always have relationship questions. And actually, a lot of my lives this month are kind of around that topic, which will be good. Like on Thursday, Emily and I are chatting about monogamy and if it's still a thing, if people are still into it or not. So that will be fun on Thursday. Tune in for that. And next week, I have someone who actually proposed to her husband. So that will be a fun chat as well. But today, we're talking about intentional dating and some relationship things. Oh, there he is. Perfect. Let me go ahead and add him. Hi, thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. I was just telling everyone it's what's on your mind, my Tuesday mental health chat that I have with different people, and today we're going to be talking about relationships. So
our favorite topic.
It should be a fun chat. For those joining who may not know me, my name is Nimade, and I host lives on Tuesdays about mental health and throughout the month on different topics. And today I have Dr. Samuel with me. Would you like to introduce yourself a little bit?
Okay, thank you. It just seems like my lighting is like really bad. I don't know if that's happening on your end.
Yeah, you're pretty dark.
Right, I don't know what's happening. Maybe this way. Is it better?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay, yeah, introduce myself. So my name is Samuel. This is always a hard question. I typically want to identify as a human being. And the reason I like to say that is because I think we do live in a world that comes with a lot of rules, a lot of definitions, a lot of expectations. And I think that sometimes we forget that we're human first. And so I think my first inclination would be to say that I'm a therapist, I'm a doctor, I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a son, I'm a son-in-law, but I think that all these things are rules. And yeah, I just typically like to say that I'm a human being. But maybe a little bit of history, I would say I practiced medicine in Nigeria for about 4 years. And in that time, I think a lot of my patients who I would interact with and who would trust me enough to share their personal lives with me got to share some of the struggles that they were having in relationships. And so what would happen was that I would ask them to come to the hospital when I was done. And I would do a little bit of family therapy with the husband and a wife and sometimes with the kids. And what I realized was that with my medical training at the time, I found that I was getting more fulfillment from doing that than doing actual medicine itself. So when I moved to Canada, I saw it as a good opportunity for me to pursue that. So what I did was I just finished my master's degree in counseling psychology. So I'm a therapist now. And yeah, I am super passionate about relationships and marriages and family.
I love that. It's interesting that you started doing your own little mini therapy sessions before becoming a official therapist, but people often need that, and they don't realize, and relationships are hard sometimes because we're kind of just thrust out there, right? Like we're told, grow up, get married, have kids, and live it. And then, but like, who's really training you? There's no class on how to be a good spouse. If you're religious, you get some of it from church, but other than that, you're kind of on your own trying to navigate those waters by yourself.
Right. Yeah.
So one of the things that you talk about that I wanted to dive into was intentional dating. What is intentional dating?
This is something that I think I talk about a lot. Intentional dating for me would simply be sitting down, consciously creating a list of things, a list of expectations, a list of qualities that you would like to see in your relationship and in your partner or future or potential partner. And so there's creating the list. And I mean, like, literally sitting down and writing these qualities on a piece of paper and saying, these are the things that I'm looking for. This is what I'm expecting to have in my relationship. And then being able to define those qualities, and I'm sure we're going to speak more on these things. But, you know, being able to say, this is what this quality looks like in a human being. This is what this quality looks like in a person. This is what this quality looks like in a relationship. When I see this person doing this and not doing this, I would be able to say that this particular quality that I'm looking for is present or absent. So having the list, being able to recognize the qualities on the list when you see them in real life, and then putting yourself out in spaces where there's a potential for finding people with those qualities. Now, that's the definition, I think, for me, of intentional dating.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to add one more piece that I think comes with everything, before everything else, and that is that all the qualities that are going to be on your list, you potentially should be able to embody those qualities before you'll be able to recognize them in someone else.
Mm. I love that you added that, because I think that that's huge, and that people often want certain things in partners that they can't bring to the table themselves. And it's like, how do you expect someone to have that if you can't match it? Because oftentimes people end up dating a reflection of themselves or of what they want. And if you're constantly dating something that doesn't match with what you want, you need to pause and figure out, like, what are you putting out there that's drawing that in?
Right. Yeah, and I think you know, it's that whole piece. If I was to create a diagram, I would say, you know, you take a really good look at yourself, and the realization is that I'm a human being who has all these factors that play different roles into making me the person that I am today. There's my biology, there's my genes, the evolution of the ancestors before me and all the things they did and did not do. And that's what I came into the world with. And now that I live in the world, there's all these other environmental factors. There's my parents who teach me explicitly and implicitly. There's the church who teaches me stuff. There's the TV. There's my teachers at school. There's my friends. There's all these influences that suggest what right or wrong is to us.
Mm-hmm.
And we taking some of these things and we walk around every day and they're defining who we are. And the realization is that you're looking at yourself and you're saying, where do I draw the line between who I want to be and who society and all these factors that I've described is asking me to be? Because I think that sometimes maybe one of the things that happens for us is we end up picking partners that would be approved of by something that defines who we are, but it's not necessarily something that we want. So I'll give an example of that. I could be someone who says, I want to get into a relationship. And every time I see someone who's short, I just don't like them. They might have all these amazing qualities. I sit down and I get to know them, and you ask me what's happening, I tell you, oh, they're just my friend. And I don't realize that the one thing that's just really defining my not wanting to be with this person is because they're short. And that might just simply come from an unconscious belief that I have. If I'm a woman, that, men are supposed to be, my husband is supposed to be taller than me. And I have literally had this with a client. So you're walking around with this defining thing that's getting you to choose and not choose people without realizing it. And maybe it's important to you that someone is tall. That's not the question here. The question is getting to realize if it is something that's important to you, or if it's something that's important because someone somewhere somehow said it was important to you. I don't know if that makes sense.
It makes total sense, and I love that you mentioned that, because I think that that's huge. Like, I'm not a therapist, but I feel like part of the reason people cheat a lot and also step outside of their relationship is because they find a spouse who meets the criteria of everyone around them. Like, what the people around them think they should look like, what the people around them think they should act like, without really taking the time to figure out like what they want and what matches to make them happy. And then they're in this relationship married to this person that doesn't fulfill their needs. So now they're looking for it outside of that because they're trying to make, there's this quote that I love, which is create a life that feels good on the inside, not just one that looks good on the outside. And I think far too many people focus on a life that looks good on the outside.
Because that's how we're raised. We're raised to focus on the outside. Our point of reference is from the outside. You're born as a child, and the first thing you see is someone else. When you open your eyes, I mean, I don't know how many children would open their eyes and be like, "Oh, I can see my body and my hands." And you see people, and I think our frame of reference on what's good and what's bad, and you know how tall you should be. Essentially, you get your self-definition from your relationships with others. So it makes sense that we would look outside. But again, I think it's that thing where as we're growing up and we're becoming adults, we're realizing that even though we had no choice, essentially when growing up to say we wanted to look inward, there's an intentional piece as an adult to say, I want to begin to do that. I want to begin to find out, to feel my way through what's good for me. And I think this thing you mentioned about cheating, it reminds me of something that sometimes I think we say about Nigerian men, and I don't know if this applies to a lot of men. I lived in Nigeria for most of my life, so I can speak a little bit to it. And it's not like it's entirely true, but there's a saying that some Nigerian men would marry a woman, and some of the things that, there's almost a sense that the wife is the pure person. They don't want to do certain things with her. They don't want to have sex in certain ways. They don't want to do, and then there's this preservation, there's this of virtue and protection that they place on the wife. And then they go out there and they do other things with other women. And so the saying is that the person he would marry, he wouldn't do certain things with, and the person he'd be able to do those things with, he would never see as a wife.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of truth to that. And I think it's that thing where, such a person might have the opportunity to look inward and say, what is it that I really like? And if I really like this thing, then, who says that this is what a wife should look like? And who says this is what this other person should look like? And is there an opportunity for me to change these definitions in a way that suits me, in a way that suits the life I want to live? Anyways, I just wanted to share that.
No, it's true. And actually, I have a friend who's from North Carolina, and that's a big thing in the South, too, here in the U.S. Like, their wives are like these pure, virtuous women, and then they go on the side and date, or do things with these other women, and it makes me so mad because it's like, well, first of all, maybe your wife wants to get her freak on too. Like, maybe she doesn't want to be a pure virtuous flower. And then, like, second of all, it's like the way that they look down on certain women while they have the ability to do those acts with them. It's like, oh, I'll do this with you, but because you did this with me, I now look down on you. It's like, well, then what does
Yeah.
it say about you for doing the act? Like, why, as a woman, am I looked down on for doing certain things while you're participating in it also, but it's okay?
Guess what? Guess what? You hit the nail on the head.
Mm.
The reason he looks down on that woman is because he also looks down on himself. And that's why he's not able to share that part of himself with his wife, because that's the person that he's spending the rest of his life with, and he's creating an image of how he wants to be perceived by this person. And that's why he's able to go outside and do these things with other people. But he doesn't have to bring that shame home because, you know, this is who I want to be.
Yeah.
So you can already see that by having this conversation, we're already talking about the idea that this person is trying to be a certain person, but is a different person in spaces where they're not being watched, or they're not being judged, or they're not being looked at, or they're not known.
I think the easiest way is to just stop judging, but you know, that's always the hardest because like you said, we all view things from the outside. But it's hard because it's like if you would not place that judgment on the act itself, then you wouldn't have to worry about someone judging you. And you often find that like people who judge the harshest, at least I found that people who judge the harshest are usually people who align with the thing that they're judging, you know? So if that man is judging a woman for being overly sexual, it's because he's overly sexual and he doesn't like that part about himself. So now he's judging the woman for it, so he doesn't have to identify with it.
Because that's the way he speaks to himself, yeah? Because that's the way he or she speaks to himself, yeah.
Well, if someone is in a relationship where they sort of feel like that's happening, how can they address that, or how can they like bring that to light to have those conversations? Like, let's say like I'm a woman and my husband thinks I should be like a wilting flower of virtue, but like I want to get my freak on. Like, how do we have those conversations? Because that's really a lot of deep-rooted work. You have, like, it sounds easy on the surface to say just tell him you want to be freaky, but if he has this deep-rooted thing that a woman who does those things lacks value, lacks virtue, how do you approach that conversation?
You know, it's so difficult. And the reason is that the reason we have beliefs, the reason we have structures in society, it's a safety thing. And when I say that, I don't mean physical safety. When I know a certain way of life, women are not supposed to do blah. Men are not supposed to do blah. We have to realize once you see women doing blah, it feels like a threat. This is why people react the way that they do to things that don't align with what they believe in. And my best honest advice would be that everyone should find a qualified, well-trained, registered therapist who they can talk to. Because, and I was talking about this with someone who invited me on his podcast, but therapy is the safest space if you're with the right therapist. It's a space where you can, and I get so passionate explaining this because I see a lot of people argue sometimes. It's like, no, people are not supposed to do this. People are supposed to do this. And you find that people just argue over and over and over about these things, and no one really changes their minds. And you leave that conversation thinking people are stubborn, people don't reason, they're not open-minded, but it's a safety thing. And in order for someone to be open-minded enough to really taking another point of view, there has to be safety in that space. And that's something that therapists are actually trained to provide. So I guess the point is, relationships are a two-way street. I either have to feel safe in myself, or you have to provide safety for me, or both.
How does one help to create that safety? Because that's something I've talked about before, especially because it's so hard for people to let down the walls. You know, we're talking about it right now in sense of changing your mind about things, but just letting down your walls in general. Like, how do you create that sense of safety and security for someone?
It's by creating it first for yourself. Because at the end of the day, if we're having an argument about something, I need to be able to be open to the idea. You know, I'll give you an example, a very, very good one. If I said to you today, there's no God, what would your response be? Would you say, okay, why did you say that? Tell me why. Are you truly open to the idea that if I said something, like, is there any evidence that I'd bring to you that would allow you be open to that idea? Or is there nothing I can say that would convince you otherwise? Now, I use this as an example because it's something that a lot of us can relate to, but this is how a lot of people think about a lot of things.
Yeah.
For a lot of people, there's nothing that you can say because, again, it's a safety thing. How many people do you think want to be open to the idea that there's no God? Like, what? Do you have any idea what that means? And so it's like, if you're able to have that safety in yourself, which a lot of us are not able to have, then you're not able to provide it for anyone else. And so that's the conflict. And that's why, you know, my first response would be to say therapy. But just to answer that, I think there are a couple of qualities that I think could help with providing safety, you know, especially in intimate relationships. One of those qualities would be to be able to be present when having conversations with people. And by presence, I mean you're aware of the look on your face. You're aware of your verbals and your non-verbals. You know, some people don't talk, but the picture, you see everything. You're like, you know, it's like, you know that, oh, this person doesn't, and like, I didn't say anything. So, you know, being intentionally aware. And you know, when you spend time around kids, you'd realize that they pay attention to those non-verbals. It's like, my daughter will be like, Daddy, why are you looking at me like that? And I'm like, how? You know, it's a lot of those things. So safety, being present. You're present for that conversation. You're aware of how you're reacting verbally and non-verbally, right? And the other piece, I think, would be to practice reflecting what people say to you. We're all judgmental people. And judgment simply means that when someone says something to you, you have an opinion about what that person is saying. And that's mostly something that people cannot avoid. But I would say that if someone said something to you or someone explained something to you, if you are present, then maybe the next thing you want to do is you want to practice reflecting what that person is saying to you. And reflecting means, if I said to you, you know, I think I'm going to travel to the US next week. Like, oh, reflecting that would mean you're planning, like, this next week, you're going to travel to the US? And I could be like, yeah. And then you want to ask me questions about that. So you're reflecting. Reflecting is trying to confirm that you understand what this person is saying, and then get curious. So explore that further with the person. So I'm not going to say to you, I want to travel to the US next week, and you're going to say, oh, me too, I want to travel to the US next week. Or you're going to say, yeah, I've traveled to the US a lot of times. You make the conversation about what that person is trying to communicate to you. So presence, reflecting, and getting curious. I think there's a lot more things that would help with safety, obviously. But I think that with these three things, if you practice getting curious, practice, reflecting, and practice being present in conversations, I think that it allows people to feel seen and heard and understood. And I think that helps with making people feel safe. So this person might be able to explain to you why they want to travel to the US. Maybe their mom's sick. Maybe that, you're asking why, you're listening, you're reflecting, and that allows people to become vulnerable, and then they're able to share things with you. And then maybe you're also able to understand on a deeper level why people are making certain decisions.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And something that you mentioned first of all was, therapy. Therapy creates that safe space, which I think is so true, and I'm very pro therapist. But as someone mentioned in the comment section, it's hard sometimes getting guys, especially, to go to therapy. What are some ways to approach that? Like, I know when I give my therapy pitch, I'm like, they give you the tools and it gives you a non-biased party, but like, what are some ways to sort of encourage your partner to go to therapy if you think it's something that you could both use?
Many people are not going to like my answer. But the best way to get someone to go to therapy is to go yourself.
Yeah.
And you see, relationships are so interesting. If I'm in a relationship with someone and I say to them, let's go to therapy, what I am not saying is there's a problem with you and we need to go fix it. And most people are resistant to that, especially men. If I was in a relationship with someone and I said to them, I've been seeing some things about me that I bring to this relationship, and I'm like, oh, I need to work on this. So I'm going to go to therapy and I'm going to begin to work on my thing. And then I go to therapy. And that person begins to see the changes that therapy is bringing in my life. Then, of course, the day I say to them, hey, I was talking to my therapist, and they said, you could show up one of these days and we could, because you're already there, you're not pointing fingers and you're not, I think it just makes it a lot easier.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think at the end of the day, I've been in therapy maybe 3 years now. And I think people don't understand how even when you think you are doing amazing, there's just so much that the world does to you. All the triggers, all the trauma, the small ones, the big ones, the things that you bring to a relationship, the things that you can only find out in the context of a relationship. There are many of these things that we ignore, and because we're successful financially, we're good in business, we have great jobs, we think it's the other person. But honestly, even when it's the other person, I would be curious about, look at what this person is doing, but I was attracted to them. How come? I want to know why. I want to know what drew me to you, even though this is what you were doing, because there's a lot to find out about yourself. And again, I guess the idea is to say, once you begin to do the work in yourself, I think that inspires the people around you. That change that we're looking for, that change that we're looking to make in other people, I think that when we begin to make it in ourselves, it just inspires the people around us and it makes it easier. And this is not to say that if you go to therapy, your partner will definitely go to therapy.
Right.
But what I can assure you is that your relationship would definitely improve.
Absolutely.
Because whether you like it or not, you are a cog in that relationship machine that's going the way that it's going. Whether it's your reactions begin to change, whether it's you setting healthier boundaries and communicating those boundaries in a way that the person is like, yo, what the hell is happening with you? And, they're seeing those things. And either way, that relationship will improve.
And I love that you mentioned boundaries, which flows nicely into my next question, which before I ask though, someone mentioned, how do you feel vulnerable if you don't feel that safety? We actually talked about that a little bit earlier, so this live will be saved, and you can watch the first part. He gave some really great tips on that. And then as far as boundaries, so we're in a time where we're all talking about boundaries, having boundaries, loving them. I know for me personally, it's been hard to set them, but once they go up, it's kind of wonderful. But the problem is, how do you have those boundaries, establish them, but not create walls with them, right? Like, because in a partnership, you still want to be able to have that connection, that interaction. So how do you make sure your boundaries don't block your partner out?
I think in the context of boundaries, one thing that we always have to have at the back of our minds is that boundaries aid in connection. If I'm setting a boundary, some of the questions I want to ask myself would be, what am I protecting? So, am I setting this boundary because I'm trying to protect myself? Am I setting this boundary because I'm trying to protect the relationship? Am I setting this boundary because I'm trying to protect myself and the relationship? And we're talking about this in the context of dating and relationships. Another question I want to ask myself is, do I understand where this boundary is coming from? Why this boundary? Another question I want to ask myself is this boundary flexible? I think that one of the key differences between a boundary and a wall is that a boundary is really flexible. It means that a boundary is live. It adjusts itself based on the current situation. And an example of that is this. I say to someone, I don't like to be touched. This is a boundary. Maybe in this moment, the questions I ask myself cause me to see that I am protecting myself in this very moment. And maybe I've established that the safety for myself in this moment is what I want to prioritize than this relationship. That's fair. Now, if I don't want to be touched, but I was in a bus or I was sitting in a car with someone and maybe someone else needed to come into the car because it was raining or because there was some danger outside, am I able to say, this is something that I don't like, and in this particular situation, I might need to change it to suit this particular circumstance? Would be a key difference between a boundary and a wall. And I think, I just don't want to say too much about this. When we set boundaries with people, there's so much that goes into it. When I communicate my boundaries to you, the expectation on my end would come with an understanding that it's going to affect you. A very realistic expectation that it's going to affect you. And if I care about that relationship, I want to be able to communicate that I understand the effects that this boundary is going to have on you. And I also want to be able to empathize with the effect that that boundary is going to have on you, and to be able to communicate that empathy to you. Because I think at the end of the day, what happens when we set boundaries is that because they're new, because they're different, and because they make people that we care about uncomfortable, for many of us, there's either I'm not going to set it because of what it's going to cause, or I'm going to set it in a way that says to my friends and family, that gives them the finger. It's like, just, I don't care what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And the reason I think people do that is because they're trying to protect themselves from the uncomfortable feelings that come with how people are going to feel. So they're essentially saying, I will not care how you're going to feel about this situation. And so it doesn't matter to me. Just do it or leave it. But I think that especially when we care about those relationships, with boundaries, we're essentially saying to someone, I care about this relationship and I care about you. For my safety, for my well-being, this is what I need from you. And this might not last forever. This is something I'm exploring. This is something I'm feeling my way around. You know, I remember one time when I met my wife said, you know, I don't like people touching my bum. It's like, that's a boundary for me. And now that has changed. And so it's like, this is how I want to be treated. But it doesn't mean that I don't care about you. And it doesn't mean that I don't want the relationship. And, you know, I know that this might be difficult for you. But if we're working together and we're doing this thing together, I think that we'll be able to, you know, preserve our relationship while having this.
Yeah, I think that those are, like you said, uncomfortable conversations sometimes. And one thing we know about most people is we avoid the uncomfortable, right? Because our brain does whatever it can to protect us from those uncomfortable moments, and we have to force ourselves to push through them. So I think it's a good reminder that sometimes when we put up that almost wall within ourselves about not caring, it's not that we don't care, it's that we're protecting ourselves from almost caring too much.
Yeah. And then not being able to set it anyways.
Right. So when we started, we were talking about intentional dating, and you mentioned the list. I love a good list myself. I lists all day. But how rigid can we be in that list, or should we be with that list? Like, you know, because you want to have your things where you're like, oh, I want this person to have this, this, and this. Well, we all know those people with those lists, and they're like, if they don't have this one thing, it's done. Like, how rigid should we be with that list?
So this goes back to the conversation with boundaries. There's some flexibility around the list. You have all those things on your list, and there's a realization on your end that, you know, you might not find one person that has all the qualities on that list. So maybe on that list, you want to have what you might want to call core or non-negotiable qualities. And then you might have the negotiable ones. And I think for a lot of people, creating this list isn't something that they're able to do by themselves. I have worked with people who really need to dig deep and see what even their core values are. Because, you know, someone has said to me once, I value family. And in exploring what that means, what this person really was trying to say is, I value someone who would always put me first. Put me first above their mom, above their dad, above. I want someone who can see me as their life partner. And then there's everyone else.
Mm.
Is that negotiable? Is that not negotiable?
So we should get like really specific when we're making that list.
Real specific. And then what's non-negotiable for me and what's negotiable for me. For some people, it might be negotiable that, you know, the person has a good job or not, that the person is financially capable. For some people, it might be negotiable or non-negotiable that the person is a Christian or that the person is religious. For some people, you know, I have a client I'm working with right now, it's a non-negotiable for them that the person has to be a Christian. And so it means that if you're not a Christian, it doesn't matter how many other great qualities you have. It would just disqualify you. And And maybe another thing about creating lists, because I think sometimes, especially when I try to do this with clients, it seems ridiculous sometimes. But, and I don't know if people know this or have noticed this. If you walk out there and you say to yourself, I want to buy a Toyota Corolla. What happens to you is as you go on the road, you begin to realize that there's a lot of it on the road. And you're like, oh, I never knew a lot of people actually drove this. And the reason that happens is because, you know, our eyes take in so much information in the day that our brains seek to pay attention to what's important to us, to what it thinks is important to us. When you create that list and define the things on that list, what you're doing for your brain is you're essentially training it to notice those qualities in people that have them and don't. And what you're also doing in the process is you're creating a situation where you're not just going out and shopping for a person, but you're shopping for certain qualities. So if you walk into a car dealership and you said to the guy, I want a car, what are they going to give you? A car. That could be a Toyota, it could be a Mercedes, it could be a Bentley, it could be anything. What if you walked into the dealership and you said, I want a car that has 18-inch rims, heated seats, open roofs, convertible, an SUV, an all-wheel drive. See, now you're creating these really specific things that allow you to be able to say no to certain things. So if you said, I want an SUV, if someone brought you a sedan, it'd be like, no. So what this does for you is it even saves you time, because if you walk into a dealership and you said, I want an SUV, and they say, oh, we only have sedans here, then you're like, I'm out. Right? So you see what happens to people is they date people for 2 years that they should have only dated for 1 day. And you can see how it would make it easier for you to get to your goal if you're not spending too much time with the wrong person, because you're on the move. You're making those decisions quick and you're moving on. So, you know, I mean, it's math, right? If you go on 100 dates, your chances of finding what you're looking for would be more than the person who only went on 3 dates.
It's true. I love also that when you're talking about the list, you said not just to write down the things that you want, but to also figure out what that looks like to you, which I think is very important, because it's easy to say like, oh, I want someone, kind of like the example you made, I want someone who values family. But your definition of valuing family might be different than my definition, because you said, like, you know, in one case that person means that I want to be put above everyone else in your family, versus for me, when I say I want someone who values family, like I want someone who's super involved with like their parents and their side family, their siblings. So same thing, two very different things. So I think that is a really important thing to note, and we don't often hear about that or even think to do that. Like, what do I mean when I say I want this quality?
You know, it's funny. I had someone who said to me, I want a guy who's God-fearing. And I said, oh, what does that look like? Said, well, he prays, he goes to church, he attends service regularly. And I said, have you ever seen someone who does all these things and isn't God-fearing? And they said, yeah. I said, there you go. I have also had someone who said to me, oh, I met this guy, he's so God-fearing. I said, how do you know? Same thing. He goes to church, he prays, you know, he calls me in the morning and we pray together. And at night before we go to bed, we pray together. And I said, have you seen someone who does these things and isn't God-fearing? Because at the end of the day, the big question is, how do we recognize someone who's God-fearing? What are some of the qualities that you'd see in someone? And you'd know that the person is God-fearing. And another piece to that is, why do you want a God-fearing person? What's your reason? Some people just want a God-fearing person because that's what their pastor sees. But how does it specifically apply to you as a person? Why are you looking for this quality? And then maybe the question is also, are you God-fearing? Because trust me, if you're not God-fearing, you see, if you go to church regularly and pray regularly and do all these things and see that as God-fearing, then of course it makes sense that you would see someone who does them as being God-fearing. I mean, I've had someone who said to me, I want someone who, I'll use this as an example. If I had a friend stay with me and they left their credit card lying around and I picked it up and, I bought something on Amazon and I dropped the card. And they came and they said to me, oh, Sam, I'm looking for something on my credit card. And I'm like, it's just $5. And I'm like, no, it wasn't me. And they're like, oh, well, it's just $5. No worries. I don't even know who used it. If that's who I am, if I'm dating someone who comes to me and says, you know what? The other day I was passing by a beggar's, station and I saw this $5 and I just picked it up. I'd laugh about it. I feel like, oh my God, are you serious? Like, did you do that? But we joke about it. Because that's in my repertoire of things that I do. But if I was someone who frowned on that, who's like, no, immediately that person shared that with me, I'd be like, I don't want to hang around such a person. Why? Why did you do that? And so the idea is that every day when we're having conversations with people that we're going out on dates with people that we're meeting for the first time, they are giving us a lot of information about who they are. But a lot of those things that they say to us resonate with us because that's also who we are. So if we take the time and sit down and define a lot of these things, see, as we're defining, then we realize that, well, maybe I'm actually not meeting these expectations myself. And then it's like, oh, okay, maybe I'm not so honest, even though all this time I've been looking for an honest partner.
Right.
So maybe I need to begin to, exhibit more honesty myself. And then in certain situations where I tell a lie, right? And then I go back to the person and I'm like, hey, you know what, bro? That thing that I said, it was a lie, actually. This is something I'm working on. Sometimes I just tell these little lies and, I'm working on it. I'm trying to be honest. And, I'm sorry about that. This will happen a couple of times. It's something I'm working on. You see what's happening? I identified something I wanted to work on and now I'm working on it. Two things happen for me. When I see someone who tells me, oh, sometimes I tell lies, but I'm working on it. Now, I not only know what an honest person looks like, but I also know what someone who's not currently honest, but is trying to be and working on it looks like. So not only do I know what this quality looks like and doesn't look like, I also know someone who's in the process, who's growing into that idea. And maybe that's the big thing. Because when we're dating, I think there's no perfect person. Each and every one of us, we have our strengths, we have our weaknesses, we have the things that we're working on. And many times we see people who say, oh, I have this thing that I do, but I'm working on it. I have this thing that I'm doing, but I'm working on it. And many of us don't get to ask, how? Well, that's because the things that we are working on, we don't even really know how we're working on it. I had a thing with my son this morning where, he was getting really agitated. And I said, okay, I'm just going to sit down here and we're going to breathe together. And he said, well, you're always saying to me, breathe. I have my own way of doing things. And I said, oh, okay, tell me how. And he says, well, sometimes when I'm upset, I go to a corner by myself where it's quiet. And I realized that helps me calm down. And I thought that was a great idea. And I said, well, that's amazing. I said, but how about if you're in a space where you're not able to get space to yourself? What do you do then? And he said, well, I guess you can breathe. And I said, there you go. So there are times where you can actually do this. And there are times where you can actually do this. But I share that to say, I asked him, how? If you have a way, tell me how, because I have this way. That's why I'm sharing it with you. So if you're also doing the work, if you're also on this journey, how are you doing it? But many of us don't ask that. So we just get into relationships. We're like, we're working on it. We're working on it. Well, I'm working on mine, but I'm not really working on it. And so when you tell me you're working on it, well, I don't really know that you're not. Oh, I said a lot of things there.
No, but that was great. And I had a relationship where I learned from that to not just trust that, oh, I'm working on it. Because I think that's something a lot of people do, which I definitely did, and I work not to do anymore, is dating the potential of someone. I've learned that it's fine if you have something that you're working on, and that's great, but I have to love you as you are right now. Like, even the things that bug me, those have to be okay, because there's a chance it may not change. I can't date or be with someone with the knowledge that, oh, that's going to change one day and then they'll be great. Because then what happens if it doesn't change? Because I've been in that boat, and 4 years later, I was like, kind of like you said before, I should have just left the dealership when I realized they didn't have any SUVs, but I stayed
Right.
thinking the sedan would turn into an SUV, and that doesn't happen. So I think it's really important for us to be honest with ourselves.
Yeah.
Well, I can't thank you enough for this conversation. I feel like I have a million more questions to ask, but that's how relationship talks go. We must ask how these guys will run. Yes. Well, like I was saying, I really appreciate your time and your conversation. I love your page and your relationship tips. If you're watching this and you're not following him, please do. Is there any last pieces of advice regarding relationships you'd like to share?
That last comment just brought up something for me that I wanted to share. When the person talked about how these guys would run, I want to share something with you guys. I want us to understand that boundaries are for protecting yourself. When you begin to figure out the ways that you want to be treated, when you begin to figure out the ways that you want to be spoken to, the ways that you want to be loved, I want you to understand that what that does is it draws a circle around you, and it shows people the door to getting into that circle. And it must come with a realization that there are people who are not going to want to come through the door. Why do I say this? I have had people who say, I was asking those difficult questions and he ran away. I was setting those boundaries and he walked away. She walked away. I did this and they left. They stopped speaking to me. And I'm like, amazing. That's what we want. But I find that makes people feel bad because they're like, they didn't even give it a chance. That's because they're not ready. They're not your person. They're not in the space to configure and understand what it is that you're trying to achieve in your life. That's like you walking into a room and you're interviewing someone for a job, and what you need is someone with a PhD. The only person who's going to sit down in that interview is someone that has a PhD. Because once you say, do you have a PhD? People are going to get defensive. What do you need a PhD for? What's a PhD going to do for you? How is it going to? No, the guy who has the PhD is going to say, yes, I do. What else? So when you set those boundaries, when you begin to recognize those things that you need and you put them forward and people begin to run, that's a good sign.
Mm-hmm.
That's a sign that you're spending your time wisely. I mean, look at it, guys. We don't even have time in the world. You have to go to work. You have to go grocery shopping. You have to cook. People don't even have time to date. So if you're putting out the time to go have a 2-hour dinner with someone, you need to be able to say the things that will send them away if they're not your person, right? You don't want them to come on the second date. What you want is for them to be like, I'm not doing this again. But obviously, I understand again where that comes from. You know, there's a rejection. You think it's because you're not good enough, and there's all those species, which are things that we, you know, cannot explore here. But I just wanted to leave that with you guys. You know.
No, that's a really great point, because it doesn't feel good, but it's also good. You know, like get out of the way and save yourself some time. I know for those of us, if anyone else is on the online dating struggle, that's also a good way to weed people out. I ask interesting questions right away to get to the good stuff and get the boring people out. Someone said, do you have any recommendation for books or literature?
Oh, there's a book that I'm reading right now. What's the title again? Let me check.
While he's getting that, I have a recommendation. It's called Attached. I actually am just starting it, but Dr. Monica and a few people have recommended it to me. It really tells you, like, it's the science of adult attachment, and it helps you identify your attachment style and also how other people attach. But I've heard literally from many people that this is like the book to read. So I'm starting it. If you want to start it too, DM me, we can chat about it. But it's called Attached.
I haven't read it. Yeah, I've been thinking about starting a book club too, because I know people don't you know, have the time to like read. Okay, so a couple of the books. Wired for Love. It's by Dr. Stan Tatkin. That's a really good book. Another book that I would recommend. Where is it? Oh, I have so many books here. There's Atlas of the Heart by Brene Brown. I just started reading that.
That's on my list.
It's really good. It talks about just having the vocabulary. The example of that is like, you know, people go to the doctor, and if you're not able to say to the doctor, like, I have pain in my left arm and it happens from this time to this time, that's what helps the doctor understand what's going on with you. And for many of us, we don't have the vocabulary to describe what's happening on the inside of us. You know, some of us get upset when we're hurt. Some of us get upset and angry when we're embarrassed. And that book's just, it just really talks about the vocabulary of the heart, and I like it. It's a really good one. Which other one? There's one by Dr. Elizabeth. I'm looking for it. I can't even find it. Let me see. This is the last one that I wanna. It's Loving Bravely by Alexandra Solomon. Loving Bravely. Talks about vulnerability, talks about courage in love, also talks about the safety that we just talked about. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, those are great recommendations. And again, I appreciate this chat so much. It's been fun talking. I love your insight. This will be saved if anybody missed it, so that they can check it out later. But thank you again for your time and for everyone who joined us as well.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for everyone who joined. I really appreciate it.
Have a good night.
All right. Okay. Bye.